Hi everybody, Nick Pastorito here. A while ago, I made a post about sharing my secret sauce, my tricks to becoming a good technical trainer. And here I'd like to go over those a little bit and introduce what I think works in the classroom. And what I think is the secret is using narrative storytelling, which is the same techniques that screenwriters use and authors use to make good stories. I use those in the classroom to make the training compelling and memorable and interesting. And humans, I believe, we enjoy stories, we enjoy narratives. We are by nature creative and inquisitive, and we can use that in the classroom by using these same tools and techniques to make something that is technical training that's not inherently interesting or colorful. We can use these narrative storytelling techniques to make the technical training interesting and fun and memorable, and then hopefully people will remember more and have a better training experience. So here we go. So how do we do this? Well, there's many different methods. Let's start at the very beginning. First thing we need to do is introduce the subject. And when we introduce the subject, we are going to give the objectives of the entire system, whatever it is that I'm introducing here. And we're going to give a general description of the different components in the system. And we're going to keep this very broad, but it needs to provide a narrative as to what is happening. And now, as I'm doing this, as I'm introducing the system, I'm alluding to the fact that we are going to speak in a lot more detail about all these different components and parts and different systems and modes and what have you. But in the beginning, first we need to understand what is happening in the system from start to finish before we can do anything else. So once we have that general description established and we understand basically how the system works, now we're going to look at each part of the system, each component, each switch, each valve, each whatever it is in the system that I'm talking about in more detail. And we're going to look at these in minute detail, go into them. How do they work? What causes these things to happen? What are some of the normal or non-normal operations of these individual pieces? And then at the end, we're going to bring it all back together. And I'm going to now, having done my general description, talked about things in great detail, I'm going to bring it back to that general description and now incorporate the detailed descriptions that I had for the individual components, fit that back in to the general description, and now what was just a black and white skeleton of a system now becomes this colorful, full picture of exactly what is happening. So I know what's happening in the system and why, and then I know how it's happening with all of these details that I provided at the middle part there. Another way to say this is quite simply I'm doing the whole by introducing the system, the parts by going into the details about all the different components, and then bringing it back together again at the whole. So whole, part, whole. Very simple, but very effective. Now, as I'm doing this, whether I am introducing a general description or talking about a component in detail, doesn't make a difference. I'm using storytelling techniques while I do that. And one of the most basic common storytelling techniques is I'm either advancing the story or expanding the story. And the difference between the two is here's advancing the story is I'm moving the story forward. So we're going from A to B, or we're going from this to that, or I don't know, in the beginning of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker leaves his moisture farm and he goes and meets Obi-Wan Kenobi. We're advancing the story forward. And there's examples of that on the airplane. If I'm looking at like a 737 bleed air system, well, I'm going to say, okay, well, the air goes from here to the high stage valve to the PRSOV. It's basically a flow of what's happening within the system. The opposite of that is expanding the story. Expanding the story is now we're pausing the narrative and now we're providing more detail. We're expanding it to fill in a lot of description about what's happening. So then when we go back to advancing the story, now we have more detail that has been provided by that expansion time. So how is this thing happening? In Star Wars again, now Luke Skywalker meets Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're in Obi-Wan Kenobi's little house or whatever it is. And now we learn all of this backstory from Obi-Wan about the Force and about lightsabers and all this kind of stuff. That is expanding the story. Then once they leave the house, now they're advancing the story again as they go forward into the world on Tatooine. So now, taking this back to technical training, we're doing this all the time because I've mentioned that we have this air going from here to there to there. But by expanding the story, I'm going to talk about what happens when the air gets to this valve or when it gets to this regulator. What is it doing there and what's happening and how is it doing that? And then we'll understand what's happening in the system. So then once we go beyond that, now we at least understand that information that's been provided in that expansion. So it's with any kind of storytelling, it's important to advance a story and expand the story and to go back and forth between doing that constantly. Now, as I do this expanding and advancing of the story, I'm also doing that to match with what I laid out in the initial general description of the system. So I'm referring back to that all the time. I'm not creating something new. I'm expanding or providing more information about what I've already said. And this is another big storytelling technique, is not just pulling things out of nowhere, but building off of what's already been established. And the trick, I think, really with technical training and with any kind of storytelling is you have to understand that you're laying a groundwork for things that you can build upon later. And in the beginning, I have to very consciously set the foundation for what I'm going to build upon later. And when I'm doing technical training, it's the same thing. So if I'm teaching a 737 pneumatic system, I have to lay the foundation for that system. And then later on, I'm going to come back to that and incorporate these other things by advancing, expanding the story, by giving more detail as I go forward. Another storytelling technique that I use in the classroom that is really effective is the callback. Simple callback, something that is used by screenwriters and authors and anybody who employs storytelling with their job. And this callback is a way of introducing something that later on you're going to mention in more detail. And sometimes they call this Chekhov's gun because if there's a gun on the wall during a scene, it has to come up later. Basically, what it's saying is anything that is mentioned or alluded to or shown on the screen is important, and it has to be returned to. You can't just leave it out there hanging. And if you do leave those threads unconnected, then it impedes the learning ability of the student because now they have questions. What I want to do is I want to provide them with questions, but also with answers. So this callback is where I'm going to, in my general description, or maybe I'm talking about a component, I'm going to deliberately introduce something. It could be a switch, it could be a thought, it could be a principle. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to introduce something that I'm going to bring back later. And by doing this, what I'm trying to do is take these two threads here and get them close enough together that the student can then connect them in their brain. Because when students connect things on their own like that, when they make those independent connections, that's where the learning occurs, and that's when things go into our long-term memory. Now, sometimes in the beginning, I have to connect those threads for the students in teaching, but the goal is for me to allow me to get them close together, and then now the student can make that connection on their own. And using this callback is one way to do that. So how might I do this in technical training? Well, again, if I'm talking about 737 pneumatic system, in my general description, I'm going to say, okay, so there's a 490-degree overheat switch, and this will shut off the system to protect it from an overheat. That's it. Now, later on, it could be half hour, 1 hour later, we go through all the different components in my detailed section of the course, in the part of the whole part whole, and we're going to get to this 490-degree overheat, and we're going to take a look at the specific switch, and we're going to look at how it senses an overheat and what it actually is doing to shut down the system. So I've called back to something that I mentioned during the general description, and now the student, hopefully, if they've been paying attention, they have the thread here and the other thread here, and now they can connect the two in their brain and say, oh, I got it. Yes, okay, there we go. So this is what they're talking about. So those are some very basic storytelling techniques that I use in the classroom, that people use when they're writing stories, that we can use all the time. And we use them repeatedly for a reason. It's because they work and because they're compelling and because they're memorable. There's some other storytelling rules that I follow when I'm teaching that I think are very important. One, no wasted words. If something is mentioned, it has to have a purpose. I don't mention it if it's unimportant. And so this is a way of filtering out a lot of the noise and focusing everybody on what the important parts of the system or the purpose of the thing is. Two, the motivations have to be clear and concise. Everybody has to understand why this thing is doing this and why we care. And clear and concise are two of the most important words with technical training, because everything has to be clear and everything concise is, people forget about concise. It's so important to be concise, to not use too many words to say something, which I might be doing right now. Here, another rule is all of these components are characters in the story. So if I'm teaching 737 pneumatic system, well, the characters in the story are the different valves in the system. They're the overheat switches, and they all have their own motivation. They all have their own traits about them. They all have their own defining characteristics. And it sounds silly that it's just this pneumatic valve, but it's true. This is how you make a story compelling, even with something as banal as a 737 pneumatic system. And here, the present references the past and alludes to the future. Everything is connected. Everything has to be connected all the time. When I'm doing my general description, I'm setting up what I'm going to be talking about when I go into detail about the individual components. Then when I go into detail on the individual components, I'm referring back to the general description, and I'm alluding forward to when I'm going to bring this all back together at the end. And at the end, the story arc is finished when all these different threads are connected. And the more threads I connect, hopefully I connect all of them, and then people have a firm grasp of exactly what is happening in the system. If I don't do my job and I leave these threads unconnected, now people lose focus because they're trying to figure out, well, wait a minute, what we're talking about this thing here, but we finished talking about the subject, but I don't remember finishing up this thread, which happens in movies where you watch a movie and at the end you say, wait a minute, what about this other character? Whatever happened with them? We don't want that. So what I want to do is introduce all the characters in the system, explain their motivations, give them characteristics, have them go on a journey, talk about what's going to happen to them along the journey, normal things that can happen, non-normal things that can happen, and then at the end, bring it all back together and recap what we talked about and hopefully put a nice little arc to this story, and therefore everybody will remember and learn something, at least to the best ability possible. So these are the tricks of the trade that I use to try to be an effective teacher when I'm teaching technical subjects that aren't inherently colorful and interesting, but I can use these storytelling techniques that are as old as time, but they work. And I think it makes it interesting, it makes it fun, I get good reviews, and I think people learn something in these courses. So if you'd like to hear more about this, I could talk more. Let me know. Thank you.